in the military deserve better. The Biden administration's vaccination mandate has forced our nation's young patriotic men and women to choose between their faith and their career, between their medical autonomy and their career. At a time when the military is struggling to meet their targets for recruitment, the Biden administration is firing soldiers we invested in and trained. Some will argue that the vaccine mandate in the military is not new. That is correct, but there are several factors unique to the COVID vaccine that make it different than other mandates. First, the CDC acknowledges that the COVID vaccine does not stop transmission. So the argument that the mandate will stop incapacitating spread in the close quarters of the military is not applicable. Second, the COVID vaccine has a risk of causing inflammation, particularly in young men, particularly the young men that comprise over 90% of our military recruits. In addition, several scientific studies, including a very large one in Israel and another one by the CDC, have shown that a heightened risk of myocarditis for children and teenagers after taking a second COVID vaccine dose. Israel saw elevated rates of myocarditis after young men were vaccinated, particularly after the second dose. Because of this scientific evidence, European countries began restricting the vaccine for certain age groups. Germany, France, Denmark, Finland, and Sweden all limit their recommendations for vaccines for young people. Norway, South Africa, and UK chose to recommend only one dose because of the risk of myocarditis. Dr. Paul Offit, a former member of the CDC's Advisory Committee on Vaccines, part of the FDA's Advisory Committee on Vaccines, resigned over this policy. He also said that even though he's pro-vaccine, he's been pro-everything vaccine for 40 years, that he wouldn't give the vaccine to his 24-year-old son. Third, the mandate ignores naturally acquired immunity. 80% of our young military recruits have had COVID. By compelling the young people to inject a vaccine into their bodies, they're accepting a risk of myocarditis. In fact, it is inadvisable to take a vaccine if you've recently had COVID. Even the CDC admits this. Our service members have spent their entire lives dedicated to protecting our country and making sacrifices to defend the Constitution. Congress should take action, and we're taking action today by saying we will not vote to get on the NDAA, the Defense Authorization Bill, unless we have a vote on ending this military vaccine mandate.
Thank you. Well, this is one of those rare days that Rand and I are doing a news conference together. It's probably in the Bible somewhere as a sign of the end times. But we have a different view of a lot of things, united on most, I would say, as Republicans. But our differences are fairly well known. But when he talked to me about this, it made sense to me. Listen, I've been vaccinated. I've had COVID. I will recommend, from my point of view, you get vaccinated. The problem here is that we're having a dilemma we haven't had in decades, and that's finding enough people to serve in the military. Our recruiting goals were way short. The conflicts in the world are getting worse, not better. We need more people in the military, not less. And this mandate is going to result in thousands, tens of thousands, of able-bodied Americans who are well-trained leaving the military because they chose not to get vaccinated. Now, I've been a military lawyer most of my adult life. Every military member can't make policy. It's up to the military command structure to make policy. It's also up to Congress to have a say about how to regulate the military. I think the policy of discharging people simply because they refuse to get this vaccine at this time makes no sense. And I am very much, you've got to follow the rules. You can't take the law in your own hands kind of guy. But we in Congress have the ability to change this policy. So there's two things I want to do. I want to urge DOD to change your policy. It literally is insane, I think, to drive men and women out of the military at a time we're having recruiting shortages because of a refusal to take this vaccine. At the same time, we've had millions of people come into the country legally without vaccination that are being sent by our own government all over the country. This is not lost on most people. You're kicking somebody out of the military who's willing to get shot because they won't take a shot. and you're letting people come in by the millions unvaccinated. So I think this is bad policy, and I want to change it. The NDAA is always an important bill to me. The goal of the NDAA is to give the structural infrastructure for the military to do its job, to make policy. Appropriators appropriate money, but the authorizers also make policy recommendations that I think are pretty sound. I will not vote to get on this bill unless we have a vote to change this policy. That's something I've never done before. So it makes no sense to me to discharge thousands of people for whatever reason, and sincere reasons I'm sure, at a time when we need to get more people in the military. We're having a recruiting shortfall unlike any time that I can remember. And you're talking about thousands of brave Americans who fought in wars, most likely, who've been deployed overseas, and most of them had COVID. So I'm going to stick with my colleagues here. I want to vote to change this policy, because if we got a vote, it would pass. And so that's why I'm here, and this is one of those rare moments that Rand and I come together, but he's right on this. Thanks.
We spend an enormous amount of money, with good reason, to recruit people into the military for military service. My understanding is it costs about $15,000 in recruiting costs to bring someone in. And it costs another $50,000 to $75,000 just to prepare someone to start serving in their first unit. This is before all the other training costs that go into bringing someone up to speed once they're in their first unit and subsequently. There are, as I understand it, about 3,400 military personnel who have been dismissed already because of their failure to receive the COVID-19 vaccination. So if you multiply that cost of what we lose, what we spend recruiting, and just with the very initial phases of training and onboarding, you multiply that by 3,400, that's a significant expense. You have to ask, what do we get from it? What do we gain by that? And is what we gain by that anywhere close to what we lose by it? And that's just in the raw numerical terms. When you look at the intangibles of this, it's much worse. These are people who we're relying on to protect us, and to defend us. It's a well-known fact that there's a problem with morale in the military, and that is contributing to an already significant recruiting challenge that we face. So you add this to that, and it's a buzzkill of the first order. But there was a Coast Guard rescue swimmer who earned high praise from the Biden administration. In fact, prompted a call from President Biden specifically to the rescue swimmer in the Coast Guard. He thanked him for his heroism, saving people's lives in the wake of Hurricane Ian just recently. That same person, that same rescue swimmer, has been requesting a religious exemption to the COVID-19 vaccination, and it was denied, and he's now facing termination. One of countless examples. You look at the economic costs, the human costs, and the resultant consequence to American national security and to the safety of our people. This isn't worth it, especially in light of the other factors that are taken under consideration. Look, whether you've been vaccinated for COVID-19 or not, I have, and I've also had the virus. Regardless of how you feel about it, keep in mind that there are people who have bona fide religious concerns about getting it. There are other people who have pre-existing medical conditions based on other things they've reacted to in the past. And there are others who have acquired natural immunity. Is this really a hill worth dying on? I think not.
Thank you all for coming. I want to thank Rand for leading this effort. I wish I would have heard his presentation. Let me start. I hope I'm not repeating what he said, but I mean, the bottom line here is the vaccine does not prevent infection, does not prevent transmission. So why would we make anybody take it? It is insane. These are self-inflicted wounds, whether we're talking about the military, within our health systems. Any parts of our economy where we force people to take a vaccine that doesn't prevent infection or transmission, again, it's an insane policy. The numbers I have, about 8,000 members of the military have been dismissed. About 17,000 are awaiting some determination on their religious exemption. So it's a serious business. But I'm here, again, I'm speaking for myself, but I'm going to speak on behalf of those that are reluctant to take it. They're not crazy. Again, we now know that it doesn't prevent transmission at all. It doesn't prevent infection. And the fact of the matter is there are safety signals that anybody who's looking at CDC and NIH and FDA data might have cause for concern about. Now, part of our problem here is that the FDA, the CDC, the NIH have not been honest. They have not been transparent. But here's the most recent updates. These are not my numbers. I've assembled them in a chart, but these are FDA CDC numbers coming from the VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, and the FDA Adverse Event Reporting System. And it shows, to date, there have been 32,220 deaths reported to VAERS associated with the vaccine. Over 1.4 million adverse events. I sent a letter to the CDC FDA in December of last year because people were going through and analyzing VAERS. They were seeing a dramatic difference in the number of adverse events reported by lot. 80% of the adverse events in the U.S. occurred with 1% of the lots. Worldwide, 80% of the serious adverse events are associated with 5% of the lots. I come from manufacturing. If you have that kind of lot-to-lot variation, that is a process out of control. You know what kind of response I've gotten from FDA and CDC on that letter I sent over about a year ago? Zero response. So again, the people who are reluctant, either for religious reasons or just based on the limited data that we're getting from our healthcare officials, they have a reason to want to defend their own personal freedom, their own personal health autonomy, and decide not to do this. And the Biden administration, our military, should not be forcing this on them, and they certainly shouldn't be violating their own executive order that says that only FDA-approved vaccines can be forced on military members of our military. I have to this day not received any confirmation from the FDA that any fully FDA-approved vaccines are being administered to our military. So there are a host of reasons I could go on and on about this, but this mandate should end. Those service members dismissed should have their position reinstated with back pay, and I think we should end the state of emergency declared by the Biden administration, or perpetuated by it.
You've heard a lot of statistics and general reasons. I'm going to go back to who I listen to. That'd be the folks back in Indiana. It's a practical state. We are disproportionately represented in our military per capita, especially veterans. And there were two issues that I heard more about than anything else in the 4 years I've been here. First one related to this. It's when this administration tried to take the craziest thing I've heard since I've been here and force employers down to 100 employees to have their employees vaccinated or lose their job. That is government gone wild. The Supreme Court jumped in to finally eliminate that crazy idea. Here, since the Biden administration, Commander-in-Chief, didn't have that type of resistance, they've been forcing this. We've had trouble recruiting. When I travel all 92 counties of Indiana, they wonder why, in a place where it's hard to get people to go there in the first place to defend our country, it used to be easy to recruit in states and counties like where I'm from. It gets tougher all the time, and this is another good reason. Who's going to go to a place where you're going to be forced to do something, or even on a level the Supreme Court jumped in and said that does not make sense? This is the same parallel to that, and this is something, yes, NDAA is sacrosanct around here. Sooner or later, you got to start using something when the reason is strong enough to make sure that you're getting something that needs to be fixed and not just go along to get along.
So I serve on an Armed Services Committee. I have 21 military bases in my state and 3 unified commands. So when I came up here 4 years ago, it was important to me to be on armed services, so I support our military. I had the opportunity to serve in the Navy. My dad had the opportunity to serve in the Army. I think it's important that we stop and think about who we should be taking care of. We should be taking care of our military members. You can have all the equipment you want, you can have everything you want, but it's all tied to our men and women that serve each and every day. And so what I think about is how are we impacting them? So this, to me, is we have, as Senator Johnson says, there's significant health concerns that people have with this. I took shots when I was in the Navy. I don't remember one shot I took that had the significant health concerns this has, or something that came up so quickly that there was mandates on it. I don't know of any shot that I was expected to take. But there's health concerns, there are religious concerns. We've got to acknowledge that our military men and women have rights, not just our commander-in-chief. So I think we have got to make sure we listen to them and stop this. We've got to stop, we've got to prohibit involuntary separation, we've got to reinstate these individuals with back pay. On top of that, I think we need to do an assessment of exactly how DOD and the Coast Guard has implemented this policy of religious exemptions. Because what it appears, it's not gone the way it was supposed to go. So one, I completely agree with my colleagues. We've got to say we're not going to support we're going to not provide cloture until we get this in as an amendment vote. Hopefully, I believe it will pass like Senator Graham thinks. It will pass because this is common sense to people all across the country, including my state of Florida.
There's no responsibility Congress has that is more important than standing up to the fighting men and women of our military. What Joe Biden and this administration are doing to our military is wrong. It is immoral. Throughout the state of Texas, I've heard from soldiers, I've heard from sailors, I've heard from airmen, I've heard from Marines, I've heard from Coast Guardsmen being terminated because they made a decision not to get the COVID vaccine. That ought to be your individual choice. If you choose to get the vaccine, that's your choice. That's your right. You can make that choice. But if you choose not to get the COVID vaccine, that should also be your choice. That should also be your right. We now know the COVID virus is far less dangerous with young, healthy individuals than it is with people that are very elderly or people that have significant additional health problems. You look at the military. The military is a group of predominantly young, healthy individuals who engage in rigorous physical training to be at peak physical condition. It is a set uniquely not at serious risk from COVID. And yet, the Biden administration has fired thousands of active duty men and women. And the numbers vary. We've heard numbers from 3,400 to over 10,000. The truth of the matter is, we have no idea because the Biden administration refuses to answer the question. We do know that this past year was the worst recruiting year in the last 50 years in the U.S. Army. We know that our readiness, our strength to defend ourselves has been weakened dramatically due to Joe Biden's mistreatment of the fighting men and women. And we also know the world has gotten more and more dangerous. We've had a disgraceful surrender to the Taliban in Afghanistan, and we're in the middle of the first major land war in Europe since World War II. Our obligation is to defend the fighting men and women of the military. And so I'm standing with my colleagues. I believe we will have 41 Republicans who say, we will not vote to take up the NDAA unless this body votes on protecting the servicemen and women. In May of this year, I introduced legislation, the Americans Act, that would prohibit the Biden administration from terminating or taking adverse action against any serviceman or woman because of his or her decision not to take the vaccine. It would also provide an avenue for people who have been dismissed to be reinstated if they choose to be reinstated in the military, and it would protect religious liberty. This administration is sitting on or declining religious liberty exemptions by the thousands. I believe the Senate should vote on the Americans Act that I introduced in May to protect the servicemen and women. This is a common sense position. When you talk to Navy SEALs, as I have, who spent years and even decades training and fighting to defend this nation, right now they're being fired for a political agenda. Let me make a final point. One of the reasons I believe that President Biden and Vice President Harris are pushing through this policy is that I believe they're doing this as an effort to purge from the military conservatives. Purge from the military people who don't agree with their political agenda. I think they're using it as an excuse from the enlisted level all the way up to the majors and colonels to the top brass. If you're concerned about the perils of a woke military, if you're concerned about the Biden Defense Department instructing servicemen and women no longer use pronouns, never mind defending our nation, we're focused on our political priorities. This is intricately interwoven with the policy of trying to throw out the military anyone who dares disagree. It ought to be your body and your choice whether you get the vaccine, and we should stand together and support the soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines and Coast Guardsmen who are defending this nation.
One final point, then we'll take a couple questions. We're currently about halfway to our goal. We've gotten 20 signatures of people who say they will not vote to get on the defense authorization. So far, we have no members of Republican leadership. And without any members of Republican leadership, there will be many in our caucus who will not have the strength or wherewithal to support this. So really the question is, and I hope the question will be asked by the press corps to our leadership, are you for or against this effort? But because by withholding their signatures, by withholding their support for this, it makes a large body of the caucus worried about opposing leadership. But this is something that the people want, it's something our soldiers want, it's something worth fighting for, and I hope our leadership will come around to supporting this. We'll take a few questions. Yes?
I just would like to clarify. So basically you're saying you would vote against cloture on the motion to proceed to whatever compromise defense bill there
The
is.
power of the minority in the Senate is if you get to 41 votes, they can't get on the bill. Many people, in fact, most of the people on the stage are interested in the NDAA bill, voting on it and supporting it. Lindsey Graham said this is the first time he's ever voted against cloture on the NDAA, and there are probably several others who could say the same thing. That's how important this is. But the NDAA is about setting policy. So we're trying to set policy, a fair and honest policy that's consistent with the science, but also consistent with respecting our young men and women put their lives forward for us. We should respect and allow them to make some of their own medical decisions.
Have you been able to talk to Leader McConnell about this?
He was present at the lunchtime discussion of this, which was primarily devoted to this. I won't characterize anybody's statements from that other than to say that, to my knowledge, no one in leadership has signed up to support the effort yet, and I'd ask, from my perspective, that they let us know if they're for or against. If leadership is against this, we'll be unsuccessful. If leadership is for this, I think we'll very quickly get to 41. For the most part, I would say that the response has been agnostic.
This question is for those of you who typically vote for the NDAA, but are you concerned about the optics that voting against cloture, delaying that process, will look bad for Republicans who are typically very pro-military and pro-defense?
Well, listen, there's no doubt that every one of us here cares deeply about our military, about defending this nation. And will the Democrats play politics with us? Of course they will. That's what Democrats do. Will Chuck Schumer come out and say, you see, Republicans have suddenly decided they don't want to defend this nation? Of course. And that's actually where it's going to come down to you guys. It's going to come down to the press corps to report fairly. The reason we're fighting this fight is because we care deeply about defending the fighting men and women of the military. And what the Democrats are doing to them is wrong, it is unjustifiable, it is immoral. We are fighting this fight because we take our obligation to stand with those soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines very seriously. And so it's going to come down to the corporate media. Are you simply going to repeat the Democrat talking points that because Republicans are defending the fighting men and women of the military, it means they're secretly anti-defense? I think anyone looking at this rationally would know that's ludicrous, but I'm sure that's the rhetoric we'll get.
So I'm on armed services. I plan on voting for the NDA because I believe this is going to get done. But I don't think there's anything more important than defending the men and women that want to serve. I served. I hope that when I served, that Congress would stand up for me. And I think it's very important. There's a lot of things I want that's in the NDA. I fought hard to get, but there's nothing more important than taking care of the men and women in the service.
Senator Scott, when you say you're certain that this is going to get done, what gives you that confidence, considering Senator Rand Paul just said he thinks that if leadership isn't on board, it's not going to work out?
I think it's common sense. I think my experience up here is that if you have something that makes a lot of sense, eventually it gets done.
If I may, a couple of you just sent a letter to McConnell about a continuing resolution. Along those lines, is there any concern that inflation and the way that it's impacted the budget could then end up with an underfunded military with this continuing resolution?
It's already. I mean, it's already happening. Look at how much the Biden administration proposed for defense spending, and look at the inflation. The Democrats don't care about defense. Right? The primary purpose of the federal government is to defend the freedom of this country. The Biden administration and Democrats sit there and they don't care. So if you look at it, if you want to deal with inflation, here's what you have to do. Don't sit there and wait for the Federal Reserve to ruin the economy. What you ought to do is start living within our means. But the CR, omnibus, whatever you want to do, we're going to start living within our means, have a regular order to go through budgets and allocate the dollars to make sure we don't have inflation. But up here, that doesn't happen. I've been up here 4 years. I can't imagine. I'm a business guy. Not having a budget, I mean, not balancing a budget, it's crazy. That's why we have this inflation.
Senator Paul.
Okay, go ahead.
A little off topic. The Opioid Treatment Act is legislation that you and Senator Braun have been working on. Do you think that it's going to be able to get through some must-pass legislation this year, and how important is that?
I don't have a comment for you right now. We'll talk to you later on.
Okay.
Yes, in front.
One just specific question on this. Are you all going to insist on seeing this vote at a simple majority threshold? Is that what would require you all to go ahead and let the NDA go forward?
It absolutely should be at a 50-vote threshold.
I can't imagine it would be anything but germane. And so, being germane, it should be set at a simple majority threshold.
And then just to follow up on a slightly unrelated matter, some of you, a large group of you actually are part of a group that have said that you would support a 7-day paid sick leave for rail workers. Can anyone comment on the legislation the House just passed?
Let's keep the focus on the topic here. We can talk about those issues.
Second row, if it's on the topic of the vaccine mandate.
Can I talk about ask about the NDA in general? Is that on topic?
Close enough.
Okay. There are other provisions like women in the draft. Are there other provisions like that and other things that you'd like removed before it actually is finalized?
Everybody has to speak for themselves on that. I'm not for the draft period. I'm for an all-volunteer army, and I'm not for drafting women.
They're closing the vote. All right, thank you, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Actually, this probably is
corporate meeting a card back from mine.
That was fun.
All right. Back on.
Hey, it's Reagan. Just making sure you got what you need. It was probably the same one I was having then, honestly. Okay, great. Okay, thanks.
Sorry about that.